She called me the family embarrassment, as if it were a title that suited me. Minutes later, her father stared at me like he'd seen a ghost, and the room that had been laughing a heartbeat before went quiet in a way I could feel in the soles of my shoes. I should say up front that this is a fictional story. The names and scenes are invented, but the questions it raises about dignity, privacy, and what it means to be underestimated are as real as any I've lived. If you like stories where the quiet person turns out not to be as quiet as everyone assumed, stick with me for a little while. We were at the Reynolds estate, which is to say we were on a lawn that could have swallowed the city block where my first apartment used to sit. White tents curved like sleeping swans, gulls hung over the sound of the harbor, and the band, an indulgent string quartet, kept something politely upbeat while people kept their hands occupied with champagne flutes. Jessica had on a dress that made a statement the moment she arrived, feathers at the shoulder, a neckline sharp as a rebuke. Her smile was the practiced one you only see on magazine covers. My mother used to call that smile showroom pretty, meticulously polished and not intended for softness. We arrived because of Dylan. He had asked me to come. He told me it was important to him that his mother be there. He stood at his new wife's side like he belonged there already, which is what makes weddings complicated. They ask you to sit in a future you may not yet understand. Jessica's mother, Paula, greeted me with what I have learned to call the polite investigation, a slow survey of my shoes, my hands, the way I took my glass. Paula's eyes landed on the modest pendant I wear every day, a small oval of hammered gold Thomas had given me on our 10th anniversary. There are things a mother cannot wear without saying who she is to the world. A deep house of pearls and preciousness is one of them. My pendant is not. When she introduced me to the room, because no one at these affairs introduces you without that little announcement, Jessica decided to supply the context. "This is Emily," she said, loud enough for some of the guests to lean in. "She's from our old neighborhood. You know how it is. We invited her because Dylan thought it would be nice to have family." There it was, a stage whisper that wanted to be cruel. From our old neighborhood translates nicely in a room like that. It says, not one of us, not in our league. The phrase smoothed over the real edges of class and ownership the way a gold leaf covers a scratch. "You must forgive her lack of opulence," Jessica continued, with that careful warmth of someone who has practiced condescension in the mirror. "Some families have a simpler taste." Laughter, thin as sugar, fluttered in the air like a net. No one else laughed at my discomfort. Dylan's hand in mine tightened and then released. He believed in keeping things peaceful. He has always been temperamentally diplomatic, which is sometimes code for avoiding storms. I took a breath and made the choice I make in public. Smile small, let it pass. There is a dignity to ignoring a slight in an ornate room, I tell myself now. But at that moment, it felt like swallowing gravel. And then his father looked at me. Robert Reynolds is a man who carries the room the way a house settles into its foundation. He had a presence that made other presences defer. He caught my pendant with a gaze that wasn't the quick glance of a stranger. It was recognition, of shape, of line, of a memory his face could not deny. He stepped back, as if someone had opened a window he had kept closed all his life. For a beat that stretched like a hallway, no one spoke. I could map the faces. Annoyed curiosity, the quick calculation of those who had something to lose or gain, Dylan's flush of confusion. Robert's eyes were not the quiet eyes of a man who had simply noticed jewelry. They were the astonished eyes of a man recognizing a fact he had believed impossible. "Emily?" he said, as if asking a question in case he had misread the light. His voice had a tremor that didn't belong on a face that age. It was thinner, breaking with something he had not planned for. Where have I seen that pendant? That was when, across the clink of crystal and the rustle of silk, a truth slid between us like a small animal. The company Robert had once run, the one sold off in a private deal years ago, the name, the boardrooms, the rumor of a buyer who had come from nowhere, the man who had disappeared into the background, anonymous and unremarkable. You could see the gears in people's heads begin to whirl. "She bought his company," someone murmured. "Isn't that the woman who acquired Reynolds Technologies years ago?" Another voice, polite and empty, repeated the question like a child's echo. Jessica's smile faltered for the briefest second. Her father, who had been the architect of their social ascent, was fumbling with a recognition that threatened the tidy narrative they'd built. I realized with a small, unshocking jolt that my intentional invisibility had a way of collapsing under attention in a room full of people who worship narratives and trophies. "You bought it, didn't you?" someone asked. It was not accusatory so much as bewildered.
Robert's hand went to his throat. His face turned something between regret and a lost composure. Who are you? I had been hiding, yes, but not out of shyness. Thomas and I had made a choice to protect our family from the kind of glare that makes children show their teeth for cameras. We chose privacy because privacy is a form of tenderness. Thomas was not a man interested in applause. He wanted his work to stand on its merits. When his patent sold, it wasn't for headlines. It was for the chance to keep what mattered to us intact.
Because there was a life before those white tents. I will go back. You cannot understand how a punch of recognition lands unless you know how the shape formed in the first place. Thomas was not a showman. He was an inventor in the old-fashioned sense, focused, stubborn, and astonishingly stubborn at remembering the small things about people. He built things with his hands when he wasn't doing the math in his head. His workshop was a garage that smelled of oil and citrus cleaner, and he kept an electric kettle that whistled at odd times, as if to remind him that the world still had necessities. He found joy in neatness and reduction. He loved the feel of a bolt turning. The patent that changed our lives was not glamorous. It was a small but critical improvement to a device used in hospitals, something that mattered when someone depended on a machine to do its job consistently. It was the kind of engineering you don't clap for at holiday parties, but you bless when you or your loved one is on the other side of the bed. When the company that made the device came calling, they offered a number that made my knees steadier than they ought to have been. There are moments when you see a future split into a dozen possible roads, and you prefer the one that lets you sleep at night. We took the offer. We brokered the sale quietly. We did not tell anyone, neither press release nor fanfare. Thomas wanted the dignity of a job well done and the quiet knowledge that it had been done right. We didn't spend the money. We invested it, slowly and with an almost monastic prudence. Thomas used to say, "Money is like heat. Keep it too concentrated and it burns where you don't want it to. Distribute it and it does work." He did not want our son to grow up around people who measured worth by the cut of a suit. He wanted Dylan to know a different metric: kindness, curiosity, reliability. We leaned on a handful of conservative choices: diversified funds, real estate held in the sort of trusts that Mr. James, the advisor we would later hire, would call vehicles of stewardship, with a professional warmth that masked the calculus underneath. Over 15 years, those choices grew into a nest the size of which made me uncomfortable to think of in terms of numbers. I preferred to think in terms of rooms: a bedroom, a studio, a small garden. But yes, the portfolio grew. Thomas stayed remarkably uninterested in its headline value. He wanted the peace it produced. Then the disease took him. There are places in grief where the air goes thin, and you learn how many noises a house can make in the absence of a familiar laugh. I was left with a quiet that had pockets in it, rooms I learned to move through without him. The investment work grew from a side task into the main one. I learned to read balance sheets the way other women learn to make soup. I hired James Sullivan because he had a head for risk and a gentle mouth for numbers.
He became, in time, more than an advisor. He became the person I trusted to tell me when I was being sentimental and when I was being prudent. We never sought recognition. I don't know why some people need to be seen. Perhaps they crave mirrors. We sought something else: a hedge against chance, and kindness enough to let Dylan live a life not defined by our money. We told ourselves that wealth without distance can become its own shackle. Privacy felt like a protective measure for the child in our family more than a vanishing act for me. So when the Reynolds Company was for sale, years after Thomas had left this world, I took an interest that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with stewardship. Robert had built a business that employed people in a town that the rest of us wouldn't find on a map if not for an exit off a highway. There was value there, and there were people whose lives would be more stable with new owners who cared about those lives more than their own vanity. I made an offer in forms that do not make good headlines. I acquired the company through trusts and investment vehicles set up to ensure continuity of employment and to keep the firm running without the noise of a public sale. I did not tell the Reynolds I had purchased it. There was no ceremony. There was only the paperwork and a few phone calls late at night and the quiet satisfaction of watching an operation restart with a team who finally felt they had the freedom to plan. If that sounds like charity, I won't argue. It was prudence and mercy in equal parts. That was the choice. I believed in being invisible because I believed in protecting Dylan, not because I enjoyed the idea of being the secret queen of anything.
I wanted him to find success on his own merits, not to become a brand attached to someone else's money. It was, I thought, the kindest selfishness a mother can keep. Back on the lawn, Robert's face flushed with a knowledge I had not intended to gift him. The room hummed again, but the tune had lost its brightness. People began to edge away, as if afraid of catching a scandal like an infection. Robert held a glass that trembled the way someone's hand trembles right before they drop the last thing they have been keeping safe. "You've been living here all along, and I never knew," he said. Not a complaint. A kind of bewilderment that felt like a wound. It is strange in the middle of a social disaster to notice the little things you have always valued. The way the sun warmed your neck through the fabric of your dress, the pattern in the grass from where the chairs had been placed, the sound of Dylan's laugh when he doesn't think anyone is listening. I clutched those small comforts like buoys. Dylan was already trying to explain, to put his hand on my back in a small protective gesture that was apologetic for both of us. "Dad," he began, to his father. "Mom did this years ago. It's complicated."
Complicated is a word people use when the truth has jagged edges. In that moment, you saw two versions of his world colliding, the one in which his mother was a quiet, ordinary woman he loved, and the one where she had been a distant, wealthy owner of businesses in airtight rooms. Dylan had always balanced on a seesaw of modesty and ambition. This revelation made the seat wobble. Jessica's eyes glittered with a clarity I had seen before in people who believe a small humiliation is a lever they can pull to change a life. "Why didn't you tell us?" she demanded, suddenly practical and hurt, as if I had wronged her personally by withholding a fact that belonged to her family. Why keep it a secret? Was it a deliberately humiliating omission? Her voice found a sour pitch of righteousness. People like transparency when it serves them and call the decision of another a lie when it complicates their social claim. I could have laid out the ledger, pulled out the investments like receipts to be shamed publicly, and explained the logic of privacy until everyone nodded in contrition. But there is a way humility becomes weaponized in rooms like that, where modesty can be twisted into an accusation and then used as evidence of deceit. Besides, I had learned that some explanations only widen the wound. So I chose a simpler truth. "It was to protect Dylan," I said. My voice was an even thing. I had practiced calmness for grief and for negotiation, and it served me now. We never wanted the money to define him. The words landed with varying grace. A few people muttered that this was noble. Others read, "We are morally superior," into it. Robert, though, had the look of a man marooned on a piece of news that made him reevaluate his entire ledger of choices. That night, when the last car left the drive and the string quartet packed the last of their cases, messages began to appear on my phone. The first was from James. "Call me, now." He is the kind of man who texts capitals when he is worried. We did not go on long. I told him the basics, the way you tell someone the shape of a bruise when asking if it will heal. He asked for dates, for names, for the face of the man who had mentioned my pendant. I told him. He said, "I'll look into it," quietly. There is a moment in every escalation when you decide whether to respond with force or to respond with a scalpel. My instinct is to choose sharpness, not a shout. I have lived enough life to know that a shout draws bigger crowds, but not better outcomes. The next afternoon, Jessica texted Dylan a photo cropped tight on my face, the pendant visible at the hollow of my throat. It was from some old article she had dug up. I recognized the angle, the way the photographer had caught the light on the metal. I had been photographed once, years ago, when Thomas and I quietly attended a memorial for a community center. We had been there for the people, not the picture, but someone had snapped it, and a small newspaper had used it in a story about local philanthropy. That picture, cropped and formatted as accusation, took on a life of its own. She didn't stop at the text. The next move was more deliberate. I received a crisp, formal message addressed to me and copied to Dylan. A letter from a firm of lawyers I had never heard of, alleging improprieties in the acquisition of Reynolds Technologies. Accusations are strip mines. They show up in neat legal language meant to scare. The letter hinted at complaints filed with regulatory bodies elsewhere, the suggestion of conflicts of interest, of opacity in purchase agreements. It was the kind of note that introduces doubt into the comfortable certainty of a life. I felt the first sourness of nausea that comes before a storm. Who had the energy to make accusations in a room? People who had everything to lose, usually, or people who thought they had the moral high ground and a camera to hold it steady. I called James. "They sent a letter," I said, holding my phone like an accusation of my own.
He exhaled on the line in a way you'd hear from a man who has been bracing himself for this. They'll try to make noise, he said. I'll pull records, discreetly. Make noise, he called it, as if volume were the main instrument of damage. And in a world where reputation has a tradable value, noise is a weapon. There is a part of me that resents being reduced to a case study in vindication, but there is another part that always prepared for outcomes like this. Thomas and I had been prudent for reasons of the heart, not of conquest. The choice to be private felt like good stewardship until it was weaponized into secrecy. Over the next days, the edges of our lives sharpened. Jessica's posts on social media, public and just classy enough to be read, hinted at deception without naming names. Small commentaries appeared in papers that liked a scandal when it read like morality play. Someone in Dylan's office asked him a question about family wealth, like it was an invitation to take a side in a debate he had not signed up for. He came home late one night and sat across from me at the kitchen table, his napkin still clutched in one hand from a meal he'd abandoned. Do you think they had complained if they knew the truth about what you did? He asked. The question was half anger, half plea for certainty. I wanted to say what I know to be true, that people will find cause to dislike you whether you wear velvet or a work shirt. I wanted to tell him that dignity doesn't require proof, that the currency of love is not measured in tax forms. But Dylan is practical. He wants answers. He wanted to know whether our choices had been sensible or whether keeping quiet had been a mistake. Do you want me to tell you the ledger? I asked. There is a tenderness in reducing complex things to concrete numbers for someone who needs certainty.
Yes, he said. So we went through the basics. Not amounts. He didn't need the full portfolio recited like scripture, but the outline, the patent sale, the steady investments, the fact that I had acquired the company years ago because I wanted to keep its people employed. I told him I had never intended to hold it up as leverage against anyone. He listened with that fierce concentration of someone who loves you, but finds the world confusingly complicated when you step outside the script he's kept in his head. Why would Jessica do this? He asked. His voice was small around the edges. Is she trying to embarrass you? To make me choose? Sometimes choosing the quietest answer does not protect you. People mistake silence for weakness. Someone else will decide your story for you if you don't decide it yourself. We agreed to let James do his work. He began to trace public filings, contact a lawyer friend, and quietly look into the firm that had sent the letter. There is courage in being methodical. It is not glamorous, but it is effective. James's manner on the phone was like a craftsman selecting the right tool for a job. He didn't promise fireworks, he promised process. And yet the small treacheries multiply. A neighbor texted a thread of gossip she'd overheard at the gym. A former colleague of Dylan's left a comment on an old post, implying nepotism. It is astonishing how fast the idea of a secret becomes a rumor, and how fast rumor becomes a weapon when someone wishes to corrupt peace. If you think this is only about money, wait. I remember Thomas saying once, when the world felt particularly greedy, money amplifies who you are. Be careful who you are when you have more of it. He meant that wealth isn't what turns a person moral or not. It's an amplifier of the choices you already make. He also meant that secrecy becomes a shelter and a trap. The shelter is comfortable until someone holds a candle to the door. Jessica was not content to let the awareness of my past be a small social embarrassment. She was, as I came to realize, mobilizing. She left no obvious tracks at first, a social post here, a wink to a local reporter there, but there were signs for those who know how to read them. An investigator at a local coffee shop, a lawyer who seemed to have memorized the Reynolds family account of everything, a friend asked pointed questions at a brunch. We met at a small bistro for lunch 1 week after the wedding. It was the sort of place that smelled of butter and caramelized onions, cables of light stretching overhead. Jessica arrived with the kind of confidence that comes from being convinced you have the moral high ground. She sat down opposite me and placed a phone on the table between us, as if the device were an offering. "Emily," she said, in that same practiced tone, "we need to talk." Her voice was sugar and intent. I could have ordered another plate of patience.
Instead, because the room was a neutral territory, and because I prefer knowing what people have to offer, I leaned forward. "Talk," I said. "What is it?" She slid the phone across and swiped an image into view. A photograph of me, years old, cropped in a way that made the pendant the center of a narrative. "You were in this," she said. "You were in every photograph from that event. You knew how to make yourself invisible to us. Why would you hide that?" "Because my reasons were mine," I answered. "Because I like my privacy." She had a way of smiling that made the end of a conversation feel like a beginning of a conflict. "You think you can hide and then step in when it's convenient," she said. You think you can make choices that affect my husband's family and not expect any consequences." She said, "My husband's family," as if I had stolen something from her. The irony was a slow, heavy thing. She had married into a family whose wealth was once in her father's hands. Now she accused me of taking an action meant to preserve the business and its employees. "But have you considered the people who worked there?" I asked. "Have you looked at the payroll, the continuity plans? I didn't buy it to hold it like a trophy. I bought it because it needed a steward." She laughed, a sound like breaking glass that had been polished. "That's a convenient story. Convenient for you." Convenient, yes. Convenient in the sense that it preserved jobs and paid suppliers, but convenient like truth being shaped to fit a comfortable narrative. She wasn't going to let it go quietly. That much was clear in the way she arranged her fingers around the stem of her glass, the way her jaw set as if she were seeing herself on a stage and practicing the lines she wanted the audience to hear. "I'm going to make sure all of this comes to light," she said, "for Dylan's sake." It was then I realized the war Jessica was preparing would not be fought in the open only. It would be fought where character is judged, by mutual acquaintances, in comment threads, in the careful pruning of truth into something usable. She wanted to force a performance. Either I step into publicity and explain, or I become the subject of suspicion. There is a cruelty to choosing someone else's theater for your life. Later, I learned of her more direct measures. Someone had been asking questions at the courthouse. Another person was combing through filings. A private investigator was spotted asking old employees about the sale. James's calls increased in frequency. He reported back to me with a cadence of concern that had the tone of someone trying to keep a building from shifting. "He or she who yells the loudest often thinks their echo is the truth," Thomas used to say. In practical terms, that meant we needed to answer, but not to fight on her terms. We needed to be measured, not performative.
There is a growing pressure when accusations begin to circle. The sense of being watched hardens the center of you. I found myself cataloging what I would say and what I wouldn't. I realized with a strange clarity how much of our lives are lived to avoid the conversations we dread. There is a cost to being understated in a loud world, and that cost can present as betrayal to those who expected you to shout your truth in their presence. Dylan, caught between his mother's desire for privacy and his wife's hunger for public vindication, seemed to shred at the seams. I saw over dinners a man who wanted to believe both of us, who wanted the house to be whole and the family unassailed. He began to answer calls less and to stay out late. The space between us in those nights felt like a chasm. At the end of one sleepless week, I sat with a paper cup of coffee and a dry, practical determination that had always served me. I called James and said, "Find out who is on the other side of this. There are times you must turn your own quiet into action." He promised to dig. He did not promise an outcome. He promised only that he would give me ammunition I could use to protect us, to push back within the bounds of what is lawful and right. There is a moral clarity in that kind of defense, not to destroy, but to deter. For now, the town had gossip, the family had questions, the lawn at the Reynolds estate had cooled, but a small stone of recognition had been dropped into a pond, and the ripples were just beginning. The next moves would not be made in the glare of chandeliers, but in rooms where lawyers draft letters and where investigators ask questions that have the power to reshape narratives. I do not tell you this to paint myself as wronged or as hero. I'm simply telling you what happened. An act intended to be protective became a lever someone else used to make trouble. It is an old story, very human in its hunger. There is a peculiar, intimate violence in small betrayals. They are not loud. They are surgical. They cut away reputation and leave you exposed in places you thought were tender. I would later learn that Jessica's teeth for this conflict were sharper than I'd guessed, but in those early days, the real battle was not yet public. I sat with Dylan in the small hours and tried to explain why we had chosen discretion. He listened with the impatience of a man whose life had been premature with questions he didn't ask when he was small. "Do you regret it?" he asked finally. "Not about the purchase, but about the secrecy." "Sometimes," I admitted. "Mostly I regret that we didn't tell you sooner. I thought I was protecting you from something you didn't need." My voice was honest. Vulnerability is not a weakness, though some make it into one. "But I also believe we did the right thing for the people who worked at Reynolds.
I still do. There are conversations that change the landscape of a relationship more than others.
We talked late into the night, and when we were finished, the room had a hush that felt like mending. But mending takes time and patience, and those are currencies that run low once suspicion is in the air. The first formal letter from the lawyers arrived 2 days later. It was not yet the thunderclap, only the kind of formal note designed to provoke anxiety, mentions of compliance concerns, hints of regulatory scrutiny, and the implication that the acquisition had been done in a way that required scrutiny. The language is always neutral until it is not. Names were trotted out like horses in a parade. Dates were given like ammunition. I showed the letter to James and to Dylan. Dylan's face went a little pale. "They didn't have to do this," he said. "No," I said, "but they did." We were at a crossroads then. Let them make noise and hope it goes away, or make a stand. I prefer a stand that corrodes without casting stones. There are strategies for these things that do not require rage. They require careful, patient explanation, and when necessary, decisive offers that remove incentive to continue. I have not yet told you about the offer. That is for a further and more dangerous scene. For now, understand that the wedding humiliation, the phrase, the smile, the small public put-down, was the beginning of something that would test every choice I had ever made for privacy and for love. It made me face not just Jessica's anger, but the possibility that my protection of Dylan had made him feel excluded from the life he was supposed to inherit in ways deeper than money. When the first echoes of complaint arrived, I sat down in my living room in the small apartment above a bakery and watched the light change across the table where Thomas had once kept his blueprints. I opened the drawer where I keep the old papers from the sale of the patent, the original copy, Thomas's handwriting smudged in places, the letters of recommendation from men who had become colleagues. I allowed myself a memory of the man who had taught me that prudence is a form of tenderness, and then I called James and said, "Prepare a timeline," quietly. "I don't want to fight publicly unless I must." He agreed. "Prepare evidence that shows your purpose," he said. "Prepare to be transparent in the ways that matter, without giving them the stage. There is a wisdom in controlling the theater of your life. I would later find that offers can be instruments of liberation. They can end a war with a single decision. They can also cost you in ways that numbers alone do not measure. But for now, the stage was set, and the players were aligning themselves. Jessica in her armor of righteousness, Robert in his sudden fragile recognition, Dylan torn between his two lives, and me, the woman who had intended to be invisible, realizing that invisibility is itself a decision with consequences. If you think this is about money, about bad blood, or about a satisfying reveal, remember this. The real work was about how we choose to be seen. If you hide to protect, how do you respond when the hiding is used as a weapon? How do you protect those you love when the very thing you use to protect them becomes the subject of gossip? Those were my questions as the days became a corridor of calls and small, precise plans. Jessica did not stop at dinner table declarations. She continued. The next scenes in this dispute would take place not in gardens, but in offices, in hallways of power where letters are drafted and relationships are tested. There would be investigators who ask questions in a tone that presumes guilt, and there would be a family whose trust would fray at the edges. I knew, even then, that choosing how to respond would shape not just a settlement, but the story my son would inherit about his mother. In the meantime, I held on to small things. Thomas's old kettle, a plant that refused to die, the way Dylan still reached for my hand when the world made loud noises. I reminded myself that revenge, if it must be served, should be of the kind that builds a life rather than breaks one. Thrive, don't tear down. That would be my compass. When James called 2 days later, his voice had that steady quality of a man who had found something and wasn't surprised by the ugliness it implicated. "They have been shopping the story," he said. "Private investigators, a few of them, and—" he paused. "There's a pending complaint filed with a regulator. It's preliminary, but it's enough to worry some of the lenders." That is the exact point where personal grievance begins to taste like legal risk. The rest of it, how letters would be written, how negotiations would be arranged, how we would end up at a table with offers and deadlines, would come later. For now, the pond had begun to ripple in earnest.
The people who thought I could be shamed into silence were discovering, slowly, that the person they had scorned had a patience built from grief and an appetite for protecting what mattered. I told Dylan what James had found. He listened, his jaw tight. "I'm sorry," he said. Not for what had happened, but for the pain the whole thing brought them. His apology was the small human sound of someone trying to fix an unfixable thing. We stood at the edge of an escalation. We could straighten the story and let the noise peter out, or we could confront it with the kind of clarity that leaves no room for further erosion. My instinct, always, is to choose dignity, to end conflict by removing incentive for continued attack. I have long believed that the best reply to malice is to live well and to create value that outlasts the noise. But the world does not always allow quiet to have the final word. Sometimes it forces you into a room where choices must be signed in ink and decisions have price tags. We were moving toward that room.
I could feel it in the way every small conversation had sharpened, in the way Dylan's evenings grew longer and his calls shorter, and in the way Jessica, who had once dollied herself in social advantage, now pushed forward like an assertive tide. I would make a choice in that room. It would be deliberate. It would not be theater. It would be aimed at closing doors rather than opening doors. Close doors so that the arguing cannot start again. End the spectacle before it grows teeth. The escalation after that decision was surgical in its cruelty. Within a week, the complaints became a small, steady machine, a troll of emails, a few pointed articles, and the kind of legal-scented letters that arrive in neat envelopes and make even ordinary days feel like a courtroom. Someone had filed a preliminary complaint with a federal regulator, allegations of impropriety in the acquisition, questions about how trusts had been structured, the kind of bureaucratic language meant to suggest a scandal without yet proving anything. The word alleged hung in the air like a sleeping dog. It made people wary but not yet ready to call an alarm. At home, the strain translated into quieter things that told me what the letters could not. Dylan growing withdrawn, meals eaten on the fly, a hesitancy on the phone when he thought no one would hear it. He came to me one night and said he needed time. "I can't do this right now," he said, his voice thin. Then he did what I had always told him not to do. He retreated into action instead of conversation. He filed papers to live separately, citing irreconcilable differences. It was a legal step that felt like an emotional one. For him, the separation was a way to breathe, to put physical distance between the story and the man trying to live it. That hurt in ways numbers never could. My instinct was to reach for reason, to pull out ledgers, to draw diagrams, to make every decision neat and defensible. But grief had taught me the limits of explanation. Sometimes the heart refuses to be rationalized. I let him go because he asked for space, and because love includes the capacity to let go when holding tight does more harm than good. James, who had been methodically gathering information, moved faster. He uncovered a pattern that made my stomach tighten, a cluster of invoices that suggested someone had paid for investigative searches, and a trail of inquiries linked to a boutique firm that specialized in producing dossiers for the purse-string side of town. He found contracts with a law firm I had never met, copycat filings in state registries, and a message chain that included the name of the lawyer who sent the first formal letter. The additional finding that unsettled me was less about money and more about motive. It looked less like a pursuit of truth than a campaign to score social points, to make a narrative where my silence could be recast as deception for the purpose of humiliation. We could have made a scene with that evidence. We could have let it become a public spectacle in which Jessica's tactics were exposed line by line. James advised against that. "You can win a public fight and lose what you value," he said. His voice was calm in the way of people who understand leverage. "Or you can use evidence to end the fight quietly." The boardroom was a river of glass and polished wood when we walked in. It smelled faintly of lemon oil and old money. On the opposing side of the table sat Jessica, shielded by Mark Vance, an attorney whose charisma sat like armor on his shoulders, and beside him Paula and Robert, fidgeting with the edges of their napkins, as if the paper could reassure them. Dylan hovered near the doorway, a man caught between two worlds, a shadow between his mother and his new wife. I had told him not to be dragged into the spectacle. He had come anyway, because he is the sort of person who wants to be present when decisions that affect him are made. Mark opened with a practiced tone. "Mrs. Turner," he said, as if the formality could replace a moral argument. "We represent interests that are pursuing accountability. There are questions about how this acquisition was carried out, and whether disclosure obligations were met.
Our clients seek a full accounting and corrective remedy. He laid out the threats without melodrama: possible reputational harm, the hint of regulatory attention, the aura of impropriety that could unsettle lenders and business partners. It was a legalist's process for a social season. He made sure to look at Dylan as if testing whether his gaze could find that vulnerable place where children become proxies for parents. I listened. I always listen first. Then I spoke. My concern from the start has been the people who worked at Reynolds, I said. Their jobs, their families, the continuity of their lives. I did not buy the company to display it. I bought it because it needed a steward. I had brought, in a slim binder, statements, affidavits from managers at the plant, payroll records showing continued employment, a package of emails documenting my directives to maintain operations, and notes from employees who had been afraid to speak publicly, but who asked that their work continue uninterrupted. I did not parade the portfolio like a prize. I laid out the evidence of purpose: operations sustained, no layoffs, slow investment in safety upgrades, a letter from a long-serving foreman that read like a prayer of gratitude for a boss who let them plan their children's summers. Mark glanced through the material with a surface politeness that did not hide interest. This is compelling, he conceded, but there remain questions about disclosure and representation at the time of purchase. My clients are concerned that the acquisition was structured to avoid scrutiny.
What I hear you saying, I answered, is that my choice to use privacy structures, the trusts, the layers of stewardship you call obfuscation, is now being framed as malfeasance. I am not foolish about optics, Mr. Vance, but we acquired the firm to protect it, not to hide wrongdoing. If your clients want to pursue proof, we'll cooperate in any lawful way that doesn't turn employees into gossip. Mark's smile tightened. We're not unreasonable, he said, but there are costs associated with clearing this up. Reputational damage can't be entirely undone by statements. We're asking for remediation. It was time then to be blunt. I had no appetite for a protracted spectacle. I wanted to close doors so my son could breathe, and so the workers who relied on continuity could stop being collateral in a family's social fight. James had laid out scenarios. He'd drawn up a pragmatic option, an offer that would remove incentive for further action. Make an offer, Mark said. I unfolded my response like a careful map. $5 million, I said. The number landed in the room like a gavel. Paid in full, up front. In exchange, your clients execute a full release of claims, withdraw any pending complaints to regulators, and any public filings that allege impropriety, and agree to a confidentiality and non-disparagement clause. Additionally, there will be a covenant that neither family will assert any claim of ownership or control over Reynolds Technologies, now or in the future. The $5 million was not theatrics. It was a calculated price, enough to be meaningful, enough to compensate for what Jessica's family feared losing, and enough to buy a clean break. It would not be a ransom for truth. It would be the price of peace. James had run the numbers, the cost of protracted litigation, the uncertainty it would create for employees and lenders, the emotional toll for Dylan. All of those added up into a sensible sum, one that would make continuing the fight unattractive. Mark shifted. Mrs. Turner, do you understand this looks like a settlement to quire inquiries rather than a determination of facts? Yes, I said, but sometimes facts are already clear to those who matter, the people who worked, the people who were paid. Facts exist outside public performance. I'm offering certainty to end this here and now. There was a silence like a held breath. Paula, who had been stoic until then, whispered something to Robert. His fingers tightened on the armrest. Dylan's jaw clenched. Jessica stared at me, as if trying to translate my offer into an offense he could not yet name. $5 million now, no more claims, Mark said finally. And you want a confidentiality clause? Yes, I said, and it must be permanent so that our son isn't dragged into this indefinitely. If you refuse, we will respond, but I'd rather end this with more pain. I don't like ultimatums. I prefer choices. This was a choice I wanted to offer without malice.
The legalistic veneer cannot hide the human calculus. How much do you value your peace against your pride? Mark's reply was a procedural parry. He asked for time to consult his clients. He left to make calls. I watched them go like someone counting the seconds until a storm cleared. 2 days later, he returned with a counter that smelled of negotiation. The Reynolds wanted an apology to be published in designated outlets, and they requested an additional associative payment for reputational restoration, a euphemism that read like a demand to be compensated for wounded pride. They wanted public acknowledgement. That was the fissure. I refused. Public apology would thrust the story back into the light I had tried to close. It would reopen the wound for our son. The purpose of the $5 million was to buy a clean break, not another stage. The back and forth tightened into a deadline,
Accept within 7 days or the Reynolds would file the complaint more aggressively, potentially adding pressure from lenders and drawing in consultants eager for the work a scandal creates. It was a manufactured urgency. I recognized it for what it was. Mark used deadlines like a lever. When Dylan learned of the offer, he reacted the way people do when faced with a choice that carries both pride and relief. "Are you sure?" he asked. "It feels like paying to be left alone." "It is," I said, "and paying to be left alone is sometimes the only honest course. We are buying privacy, which is not shameful. We are buying the ability for you to live your life without an ongoing stain." He left the room then, and for a while I wondered whether he'd already made his choice in the quiet of his head. He'd needed distance to sort emotion and reason into separate drawers. That distance had cost us companionship for a season, but it had given him, possibly us, a way back later. Jessica's camp attempted one last push. They threatened an amplified complaint and hinted that if the payment were made, the Reynolds would accept it, but also follow up with a narrative that would allow them to reclaim face. It was a posture of someone who knew how to perform victimhood for gain. That was the moment when James stepped forward with the other evidence he'd found: invoices showing payments to private investigators, records of outreach to employees encouraging them to talk to reporters, and a ledger of expenses tied to a boutique PR firm known for narrative shaping. It was not illegal, but it was damning in an ethical sense, an attempt to manufacture a moral high ground by marshalling witnesses and questions. Mark looked at the documents, and for the first time his practiced ease faltered. "Even if some of this exists," he said carefully, "it does not excuse alleged structural issues with the acquisition." "No," James agreed, "but it puts the costs into context. If we litigate, we don't just litigate the acquisition, we litigate a campaign."
That's messy, and I'm telling you now that my client will defend vigorously. That defense will reveal motives and methods that your clients would prefer remain private. Negotiations became less theatrical and more pragmatic. Paula wept quietly in a corridor the day she realized the fight might cost more than the satisfaction of being proven right. Robert, a man not given to soft displays, called me aside and said, "I never imagined this. I am sorry it touched you." There was a rough sincerity in his apology. It wasn't a public clearing of the ledger, but it was something that mattered more than words in that room, an admission that the pride they'd built had been brittle. In the end, Jessica held out only so long as pride allowed. The Reynolds family was not as financially ironclad as their public image suggested. The rumor of instability was not just gossip. It had teeth. Mark knew that protracted litigation would expose his clients to costs that could exceed the $5 million offer. He also knew that the employees and vendors at Reynolds would suffer if the company were dragged into a long investigation that threatened lending lines. Ultimately, his client's fear of collateral damage outweighed the satisfaction of a performative victory. She signed the agreement. There was an odd grace in the way she did it, not quite the humbled pen of someone chastened, but a pen moving with the resignation of someone conceding that the fight wasn't worth the future. The document demanded a sworn release, withdrawal of pending complaints, a non-disparagement clause, and an agreement that any further public statements would be met with consequences. In short, a clean separation. The $5 million was transferred through channels that James had arranged in a way meant to be transparent but not ostentatious. I watched the numbers move like a small winter weather system sweeping the surface of a pond flat. We had bought the quiet we sought, but not without a price. The divorce followed. Formal proceedings can be mercifully efficient or painfully slow. This one was brisk. Dylan filed the paperwork to separate, and eventually the sharp pieces of their marriage were laid bare in private filings that everyone pretended not to read. I felt the small, steady grief of a mother who had watched a son break, and had the helplessness of knowing that the break had been at least partly of my making. He had asked for honesty and had been told by circumstances instead. For months after the settlement, Dylan moved in and out of my life like a tide. Some days we spoke for hours. Other days I watched his number appear and then disappear, as if he had rehearsed his withdrawal. He dated, drank too much some nights, and in small ways reminded me of a younger man, angry, uncertain, trying to build a new map. Then slowly, as the glare receded, he began to find steady ground again. Time has a particular way of smoothing edges when you let it. The settlement closed some doors, yes, but it opened others. The immediate relief was palpable. The regulators' preliminary interest lost momentum when the complainants withdrew their formal statements. Odds and ends of gossip faded. The employees at Reynolds sent me notes of thanks.
One forged a holiday card with a photo of the factory floor and a backstage thank you scribbled across the back. Those cards mattered to me more than any public victory would have. I did not take the $5 million and change my life into a parade. I used almost none of it for personal extravagance. Instead, after much thought, calculations, and a few late-night calls to people whose judgment I trusted, I sold the small apartment above the bakery, the one Thomas and I had kept, and moved out west. Santa Fe has a light that seems to pull things into moderation. The high desert thins the noise in a way that makes decisions feel less performative and more elemental. I found a house with thick adobe walls and a yard that had space for vegetables and a small studio where I could sit and remember without being haunted. I kept the kettle that had whistled in Thomas's garage and put it on a small burner next to the window. There, among juniper and quiet mornings, I founded the Thomas Fund. The Thomas Fund was not the kind of foundation people photograph for magazine spreads. It was small and purposeful. Grants for technical training in towns where manufacturing jobs were changing, scholarships for engineering students who wouldn't otherwise have access to labs, micro-grants for small companies looking to improve safety at industrial plants. Its structure was simple: pragmatic grants named in homage to the man who had preferred the work to the applause. It was my way of ensuring that the money produced by that small patent could continue to do the thing Thomas had always hoped for: improve the lives of those whose work mattered. I kept my profile low. The fund issued annual reports that were plain and useful. We published the names of the projects we supported and the metrics we cared about: jobs saved, apprentices trained, safety incidents reduced. We did not seek displays of gratitude. Instead, we tried to measure outcomes and close feedback loops on our efforts. The work suited me. It combined prudence with mercy in a neat, reproducible way. Dylan returned to my life in bits and pieces. He dated, as I said, and in time he introduced me to Sarah, steady, warm, and not at all theatrical. She had a laugh that managed to be both private and generous. Watching them together felt like watching someone relearn how to trust the world after a storm. They moved slowly, deliberately. Eventually, they married in an intimate ceremony that felt to me like a conscious choice to accept life, even after being bruised by it. Our reconciliation was not cinematic. It wasn't a single dramatic apologetic moment with cameras and proclamations.
It was small things: phone calls where we argued then laughed, dinners where we would cook together in a rhythm of clumsy coordination, afternoons spent in the yard fixing broken chairs, like a metaphor for our relationship. He forgave me, as much as a son can forgive a mother who tried to protect him and instead made him question the foundation of his life. We rebuilt trust on small, repeated acts of care. Jessica, meanwhile, moved on in ways that felt inevitable. Whether the Reynolds family ever regained the public air they sought is less important to me than the quiet fact that their narrative no longer orbited around me. The settlement bought us a margin in which we could live a life not structured by performance. Years later, I would sit at a small library table in Santa Fe and read letters from grantees whose work had been changed by a modest Thomas Fund grant. There was a letter from a plant supervisor who told me that the new safety rails we'd funded saved a worker's hand from a serious injury. There was the note from a scholarship student who had been the first in her family to study in a lab. Those letters quieted something deeper than any vindication could. They reminded me that the most satisfying revenge is the one that builds life rather than destroys it. Of course, there are complexities I did not and could not fix. The divorce was final. Dylan and Jessica remained estranged for a season that lasted longer than either of us expected. The public gossip receded but never completely disappeared. There are always new stories ready to step into old gaps. But the pressure eased enough for the important things to resume. Sunday dinners, the shared holidays where sarcasm and tenderness cross paths, and the small ways of family returns to itself. People often ask me if I regret the secrecy. They imagine that if I had only been more forthcoming, this mess would never have happened. The answer is complicated, as real choices often are. I regret that the secrecy made Dylan feel excluded. I regret the pain it cost him. But I do not regret the motive behind it. I do not regret our desire to let him grow on his own terms. I believe the shelter we built around him in his youth allowed him to step into adulthood not clouded by entitlement. And for all that cost, I think the outcome, his eventual independence, his steady partner, his work on his own terms,
Was worth some of the missteps. If the story has a moral, it is less an aphorism than a practice. How you choose to be seen matters. There is dignity in privacy. There is also a responsibility that comes with hiding things from those you love. The balance between protecting and withholding is a precarious one, and it shifts with the seasons of life. I learned another lesson about anger and craft. I have always preferred patience to melodrama.
Years of tending to investments, making pragmatic choices for their long-term benefit, and learning to read risk like a language taught me how to respond, not with spectacle, but with precise decisions. The $5 million was not spite. It was a bridge. It bought a clean cut, ensured employee paychecks, and allowed my son to breathe again. It cost me the image of a mother whose life was private, but it saved what I cared about most. The Thomas Fund continues to operate. We support apprenticeships that teach the very skills Thomas loved: metalwork, instrumentation, and practical engineering that returns dignity to a laborer's day. We fund community centers in towns like the ones where Reynolds once employed people. We do it quietly, without fanfare, because there's an exquisite pleasure in watching a project scale because someone finally had access to the resources they needed. On the rare afternoon when I drive into town and the desert light throws shadows across my dashboard, I think about what it means to be recognized. The first time Robert Reynolds looked at me and saw something he had not expected, the room went quiet. For a moment, I felt exposed. Now, in retrospect, I can see that exposure for what it was: a reckoning of two different kinds of pride. His was public and brittle. Mine was private and, in its own way, stubborn. Would I change the specifics if I could? Perhaps. I might have told Dylan earlier. I might have let him in on the ledger, not because he needed money, but because he needed to understand the shape with the choices we'd made for him. But the architecture of our lives was built in the quiet of a marriage and the loss of a husband. We made mistakes, but we also did things from a place of love. If you find anything in this story worth carrying with you, consider it this: the most effective reply to humiliation is not always to humiliate in return. Sometimes the answer is to build, to secure, and to give. Let your life be the kind of rebuttal that arrives after the dust has settled: steady, useful, and generous. Let your version of revenge be one that improves the world for others rather than one that destroys a person who once scorned you. In the end, I learned to see revenge as a shape you can fill with dignity. So what would I do if it happened again? I would be braver about telling the truth to the people who needed to know it most, first my son, then the people directly affected by my choices. I would still protect privacy against the glare of spectacle. I would still choose peace over publicity. But I would guard against the kind of secrecy that leaves loved ones feeling excluded. The balance is not a formula, it's a conversation. And the only way you learn the rhythm of it is by living through the mistakes. If you have a thought about this, what would you have done in my shoes? Tell me in the comments below. I'd like to hear how you'd weigh dignity against disclosure, privacy against the need for open family conversation.